Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we are diving straight into a truly incredible first-hand oral history from a Londoner who lived right through the Second World War. But here's the thing. We aren't looking at this through the eyes of a general or some high-ranking politician. Nope. We're going to experience the onset of a massive global conflict through the eyes of an ordinary teenager, someone whose daily, normal life was just drastically interrupted.
Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine being a 15-year-old girl. For her, the whole concept of a global war was entirely abstract. She completely admits she didn't fully grasp the sheer horror of the adults around her. I mean, for them, the absolute nightmare of the war to end all wars was literally coming back to life right in front of their eyes.
But, that abstraction began to fade pretty quickly as the geopolitical wheels started turning. Now, what's crucial to understand here is that the war didn't just explode out of nowhere for Londoners. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain actually managed to delay the official outbreak of the war by about a year. And that one-year buffer, it was absolutely critical. It gave ordinary citizens the actual time they desperately needed to mentally and practically prepare for the great unknown.
So, what did that preparation actually look like on the ground? Well, it started with the kind of surreal task of taping up perfectly good windows, literally just to stop the glass from shattering into deadly shrapnel during a blast. And there were some incredibly heavy family decisions being made too. She and her grandfather actually had an offer to evacuate to Southport. Her uncle even made this solemn promise to her mother that if the worst happened, he would step in and raise her alongside his own two daughters. Ultimately, though, the family chose to stay home in London. And for a little while, it actually felt like the right choice during that bizarrely quiet period we now call the phony war, where evacuees actually began trickling right back into the city.
Amidst all this crazy tension, teenage life stubbornly marched right on. She and her friend Hilda were studying for their matric exams. Those are the really critical school leaving qualifications. And they would literally sit down in the damp school bomb shelters doing their coursework. But I absolutely love this detail. No matter how much homework was piled up, or honestly, how dire the news was on the radio, Friday afternoons were strictly, not negotiably, reserved for going to the pictures. It's just a beautiful reminder of how fiercely people protect their sense of normalcy.
Section 1. Entering the wartime workforce. Stepping into the real world.
Right, so with exams out of the way, her mother laid down a pretty strict ultimatum. You do not leave school unless you have a job lined up. This pushed her straight through commercial classes in typing and shorthand and, as she called it, the horror of horrors, commercial French, and right into a trial-and-error job hunt. First, she aimed for this glamorous theater box office job and got flat-out rejected. Then, a library job opened up, but guess what? Her friend Hilda swooped right in and took it. She finally landed her first real gig at the local gas company. It was a quick 10-minute bike ride, but the daily commute involved a major hazard, constantly trying not to get her bicycle wheels dangerously stuck in the city's tram lines. And her main task? Basically sorting colored tickets to figure out who got free cooker repairs and who had to pay up. Which actually brings us to a hilarious family moment. To prep for this new job, she had to memorize all these totally obscure accounting codes for different gas appliance parts. She spent an entire evening being tested by her mother and brother. At one point, trying so hard to recall the code for a cooker door, she confidently blurts out, "Cockador." Her family ruthlessly and, of course, lovingly teased her about the cockador for ages. It's exactly these tiny, funny, everyday human moments that make history feel so incredibly alive.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how she actually left her next job, because it was an act of pure, brilliant teenage rebellion. Her brother Clifford was off fighting in the war, so she applied to his hospital's X-ray department, really hoping to hold his spot for when he got back. Instead, this rather dismissive interviewer forced her into the accountancy department. She absolutely hated it. One day, the miserable accountant told her to simply draw lines at the bottom of the pages, just to keep her busy. Well, in a stroke of genius teenage rebellion, she didn't draw them at the bottom. She drew these thick, dark lines halfway down the page right where the writing stopped, completely ruining his perfect, neat ledgers. Then she simply went home, told her mother she was having a minor nervous breakdown, and quit on the spot.
Eventually, though, she did find her footing at Frederick Brady's Iron and Steel Merchants over on Euston Road. Now, this was considered a reserved occupation, which basically meant she wasn't allowed to leave for the wider war effort. Her primary battle here was purely logistical. She operated this massive addressograph machine, which stamped customer addresses. The daily struggle? Trying to categorize businesses as either town, meaning they're still in London, or country, because so many London firms were constantly packing up and evacuating to the countryside just to avoid the bombs.
Keeping track of who was where became an absolute administrative nightmare.
Section 2. Surviving the Blitz. The reality of war at home.
While office life definitely had its quirks, the reality outside the window was growing increasingly grim. The sheer massive scale of the war anchored itself directly into her daily morning commute. Getting to work became wildly unpredictable. Trams would frequently just stop halfway because the tracks ahead were simply destroyed, forcing everybody to walk the rest of the way through these freshly flattened city blocks. She specifically remembers a massive local landmark, the Carrera cigarette factory, being completely leveled overnight. The Nazis probably thought it was some key strategic target. But for everyday Londoners, it meant waking up every single morning not knowing if your workplace or even the streets leading to it would exist by sunrise.
And the nights were just exhausting. Let's walk through this grueling nightly routine she and her mother had to endure. First, they'd wait for the terrifying wail of the warning sirens. Then, they'd climb down into this damp, sunken metal hut right in their garden. They'd desperately try to grab a few hours of sleep on these hard, incredibly uncozy metal bunks while literal bombs fell from the sky above them. Then, as soon as the morning all clear finally sounded, they'd climb out, wash up, dress properly, and head straight to work. Just day after day after day.
Honestly, the normalization of all this destruction is literally shocking. She relates this one story of returning from a really peaceful holiday out in the country at Whisper Green, only to find that her friend Jean's London flat had been completely bombed out. And what did they do? They literally stood right there in the ruins of the dining room, drinking tea, and simply threw the slops from their cups over their shoulders onto a pile of rubble. It perfectly captures that unbelievable, classic British stiff-upper-lip mentality. You just carry on.
To maintain any sort of mental survival through all of this, people develop these highly unique coping mechanisms. When the V-1 flying bombs, the infamous doodle bugs, started raining down, she and her friends would literally be queuing for the bus, just watching them fly overhead. They lived by what they called the doodle bug rule. If you could actually see the bomb flying, it would never get you. Now, they fully knew this logic was completely flawed, but believing it, that gave them the exact mental shield they needed just to stand in line and go about their day without completely breaking down.
Section 3. Rations and Resilience. So the crucial point is the sheer logistical challenge of keeping the home front fed. Surviving the bombs wasn't the only battle. Keeping the population fed required some extreme limitations. Look at these numbers. Per person per week, you were granted a mere 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of cooking fat, and 4 ounces of margarine. For us today, visualizing this amount is genuinely shocking. That is hardly enough fat to spread on your morning toast for a few days, let alone cook an entire week's worth of meals for a family. Because of this intense scarcity, an incredible economy of sharing just blossomed instead of a culture of complaining. The ration books used a point system for rare luxury items like tinned fruit or biscuits, and the local grocer would meticulously cross them off. When bread was eventually rationed, those who didn't need sandwiches shared their loaves with the larger families who did. Neighbors would actively barter tea leaves and sugar based on who liked their tea sweet. And what's most remarkable to me is her absolute pride in stating that her family completely avoided the black market, no exceptions. They relied entirely on community support and sharing rather than taking any illegal shortcuts.
Eventually, victory finally came, but it was frustratingly staggered. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, there was, of course, massive joy and relief. But in all that wild celebration, many momentarily forgot the thousands of soldiers who were still fighting a totally brutal war over in the East. It wasn't until August 1945, when the war in Japan ended, that families could truly exhale. And even then, it was this agonizingly long wait for soldiers like her brother Clifford to slowly make the long journey back by sea from places like Penang.
The reunion with her brother Clifford is just incredibly poignant. When she finally met him after a Liverpool football match, he was reduced to all bone. She genuinely didn't recognize her own brother standing right in front of her. It was only when he called out her name that she finally recognized his voice. It's just a stark, heartbreaking visual reminder of the extreme physical toll this war took on those serving overseas. And this brilliantly illustrates a huge, unspoken cultural rule of the immediate post-war era. The rule was simple: look forward and never, ever dwell on the past. The men who returned absolutely never spoke about the horrific things they had endured. It was essentially mass trauma suppression. Visually, this blending back into society was aided by the famous D-Mob outfit. Returning soldiers were issued a suit, an overcoat, and a trilby hat. And almost everyone chose the exact same gray pinstripe suit, meaning a whole generation of deeply traumatized men walked the streets looking entirely identical, quietly blending right back into a civilian world that was desperately trying to forget.
On a much, much lighter note, the gradual lifting of these wartime restrictions brought some immense, incredibly simple joys. When the day finally arrived that clothing coupons were permanently abolished, what did our narrator do? Did she go out and buy a fancy ball gown? No way! She rushed straight down to the local draper to buy a fresh, crisp, clean pair of pajamas. She was simply thrilled to no longer be sleeping in heavily patched up, worn-out clothes.
Section 4. Rebuilding Post-War London. Connecting the Blitz's aftermath directly to urban development.
So, the bombs had stopped falling, but the damage was already done. Entire neighborhoods had literally been erased from the map, displacing thousands and thousands of people. The brilliant, incredibly rapid solution to this unprecedented crisis was the prefab home. These were prefabricated houses, often imported, that could be assembled at lightning speed on pretty much any available patch of grass or village green. They were highly efficient, they got quickly hooked up to local drainage, water, and gas. And they weren't just temporary shacks either. They were genuinely nice, properly plumbed homes. In fact, many families ended up loving them so much they eventually bought them and lived happily in them for decades.
And that actually leaves us with a fascinating, very direct thought from our narrator herself. Reflecting back on the rapid, highly effective construction of those 1940s prefabs, she asked this exact question. With the severe housing shortages we are facing in our world right now today, why haven't we gone back to the idea of building prefabs? It's a seriously provocative thought, isn't it? It leaves us to wonder how the ingenious rapid-fire solutions of the 1940s might just be exactly what we need to solve the crises of today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope you learned something new.